What do all these paintings have in common? The answer is that they all use the white of the paper. When most painters sit down to do a painting, they don't have to think too hard about the white areas of their painting because they just use white paint. But when watercolour artists sit down to do a painting, they really have to plan in advance exactly where all the white parts of their painting are going to be. That's because white watercolour paint doesn't really exist. Watercolour artists get around this problem by using opaque gouache in their paintings, and this works fine. In fact, I've got an entire side of my palette just for gouache paint. The problem is, once you start using gouache, you lose all of the nice qualities of watercolour paints, like transparency and granulation. So how do you get around this problem? All you need to do is make sure that you're aware of where the white parts of your painting are going to be, and simply don't paint them. It's pretty difficult to do this in practice because you have to constantly be thinking several steps ahead of yourself. So I think the easiest way to see how I personally like to use the white of the paper when I'm painting is to take a look at something that I recently painted. This is a scene in Germany that I found as part of my challenge to paint every single country in the world using Google Earth. And because there was lots of snow in this scene, huge parts of the painting are almost entirely just left as the white of the paper. The first thing I tried to remember in this painting is to let the water paint for me. So as I was using a wet in wet technique in the sky, I made sure to leave the entire left-hand side of the painting white with no paint dropped into it. Then as the paint and the pigment started to mix on the page, it basically did all the work for me. You'll notice that there's a line of white where excess water has dripped down. I actually didn't mean for that to happen, but I really like how it came out, and this is a great example of letting the water do the painting for you. As I move down the page, I try to contrast some of the blurry wet on wet section in the sky with some harsh, solid shapes, which was achieved by using wet on dry, which is essentially just painting water on a dry piece of paper. If you want to leave sections of white that really pop and stick out from the painting, this is usually the best way to do it. Usually when you're painting wet on wet, the white areas become a little more faded and hazy, which is great for things like skies. But then if you want a more solid white line that cuts through the painting really strongly, then do it when you're painting on dry paper. Another tip that I use a lot is to break up my brush strokes and make sure I'm not just sweeping my brush across the entire paper. Obviously, if you do that, then you're not going to be able to retain any of those whites. So in order to stop myself, I try to pick up the brush, dot it around, dab it around the paper as much as possible. It's just a physical way for me to remind myself that I shouldn't be painting the entire paper in one value of paint. Now obviously it really depends on your subject matter here, and this applies a lot more in landscapes, but I think it's an important thing to remember for any subject matter, because no subject matter is going to have one flat value across the entire painting. There's always going to be light and shadow, so you always need to make sure that you're retaining lighter sections of the painting somewhere and darker sections with more pigment and less paper showing through in other areas. Now I did go into some sections of this painting at the end and add some white gouache, and that's great. I really don't have a problem with doing that at the end. I know some purist watercolour painters don't think you should be using gouache at all, but you're always going to have sections, especially if they're really small sections that you've tried to retain. It's going to be really difficult to retain those, and sometimes it just feels more natural. For example, here with this line, it's far easier for me to just paint a white line with a brush than to try and carefully paint around that section. So that's the final thing I have to say. If you've been trying really carefully to keep an area white and you've just accidentally paint over it, don't panic. Just buy yourself some white gouache, and at the end just go over it and it will all be fine. So if you want to try out this technique for yourself, I would try and find a subject that has a lot of white in it. So maybe a snowy scene, or a scene that has a lot of bright highlights contrasted against some dark shadows, and just practice this technique. It's also really fun to practice clouds and skies and retaining the white of the paper that way, because it's actually quite difficult to do when you're doing it wet on wet. So it's a really good way to practice controlling your paints. That's all from me this week. Subscribe if you haven't already. Comment what some of your biggest struggles are when it comes to watercolour painting, and I'll see you in the next one.